The Game Awards, the most prestigious game award show, and it's almost that time of the year again, where we start to debate which game should win Game of the Year and what game got robbed. But let's look back at all the previous winners and rank them all from worst to best. And let's go even further back to the 2010s when the show was called the Spike Awards, which includes even more amazing games that I will talk about in this list, as I do have some pretty shocking opinions later on. And just a quick disclaimer before we start, these games are some of the best games released in the last 20 years, and just because your favorite game is ranked lower than you think it should be doesn't mean it's bad in the slightest. And if you disagree with my list, just leave a comment down below and we'll have a discussion about it. And let's get to the ranking. Coming in at last place, we start off with the first game that was ever given the Game of the Year award, and that game is Madden NFL 2004. This has to be the most absurd game that has ever received the award if it wasn't for another game coming up soon. Madden NFL 2004 is the only time that a sports game has won the award, and to be honest, I haven't really played any Madden game at all, but I can't imagine that it's better than some of the other games that were nominated for this award, with the standouts being Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, Splinter Cell and Tony Hawk's Underground. Out of all the mentioned games, I think that Madden isn't even the best sports game on the list, as I personally think Tony Hawk deserves it over this game. But even with all the nominations, one of the best games in 2003 wasn't even nominated, with Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. That brings us to 2016, a banger of a year for gaming, with masterpieces like Doom 2016, Uncharted 4 and Dark Souls 3 releasing. So let's take a look at which game won Game of the Year. It has to be an all-time great, right?
Overwatch.
So yeah, Overwatch won out of all these games for some reason. But don't get me wrong, I still love Overwatch, but Game of the Year? Come on. I have no clue what they were smoking. But all my bias aside, Overwatch brought the hero shooter genre to the foreground with its fun gameplay and unique abilities of all the heroes. Overwatch also required close team cooperation to be successful, which made it even more fun to play with your friends or just solo queue. But due to the nature of the multiplayer genre, it's hard to properly describe just how fun the game was, as today it's a shadow of its former self. Since the rebrand in 2022, making it Overwatch 2, the game has been under constant fire with a lot of questionable decisions, like the cancellation of the PvE mode that they promised to the community and all the things going on behind the scenes over at Activision Blizzard. So all of this makes Overwatch the most absurd game to win Game of the Year, and is probably also the reason why a multiplayer game hasn't won the award since. Next up in 19th place, we have the game that first won the Game of the Year award after the show got rebranded from the Spike Awards to the Game Awards, and that is Dragon Age Inquisition. This is the third Dragon Age game and is my favorite in the series, and it also is the last good game that BioWare has released, as Mass Effect Andromeda was a massive disappointment with its game-breaking glitches and weak plot, and Anthem being Anthem. I still do prefer the Mass Effect series over Dragon Age. It has a narrative with choice-based storytelling leading to branching storylines and different outcomes that all feel different and natural. The combat systems are changed up quite a bit from the previous Dragon Age games, as it introduces the tactical overview, but it also has real-time combat. So while I do prefer the real-time gameplay of Mass Effect over the more strategic gameplay that the previous Dragon Age games had, Inquisition makes it easier to get into, which is pretty neat. And Inquisition also gives you the option to just ignore some of the more tactical aspects of the game if you don't enjoy them, and you don't really get punished for it. The various classes that are all unique in playstyles bring a fun dynamic into the combat system, which I really like. Overall, this is a really solid game, and when you take a look at some of the other games that were nominated in 2014, like Hearthstone, Dark Souls 2, Bayonetta 2, and Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, I do think that Inquisition is the best game out of all of these, but my Game of the Year would have gone to Alien Isolation, which wasn't even nominated and is still super underrated to this day. Which leads us to The Walking Dead, the game. This is the Telltale version of The Walking Dead with their unique branching storylines and choice-based storytelling. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of these types of games, but I do have to admit that The Walking Dead is really good and has a great narrative. But once again, when we look at all the other candidates that were nominated, I do think that there are a couple of games that do deserve the award over this one. So let's take a quick look. The other nominated games were Assassin's Creed 3 and Journey, but the main two big hitters have to be Dishonored and Mass Effect 3. These are both absolute bangers in their own genre, with Dishonored being one of the best stealth games of all time and Mass Effect 3 being one of the best story-driven games of all time. So when I took a deeper look at The Walking Dead, it's actually pretty surprising that it won over these two masterpieces, as The Walking Dead has a fantastic story with some pretty heartbreaking decisions that you have to take, yeah, but apart from that, the gameplay is pretty lackluster and dull in my opinion, as it really isn't nearly as deep as you would think it is. games, with a lot of the game relying on quick time events that in a lot of cases when you fail them just cause a reset, so it doesn't feel as though the game is as open-ended as you were made to believe. But this is totally subjective and not the main selling point of the game anyways, so this is just a personal gripe. And at the end of the day, The Walking Dead delivers on the story they were trying to tell, which is still fantastic. But this next game has an even better story than The Walking Dead in my opinion, and that game is It Takes Two. And I have to say, this is one of the most deserving and feel-good games to ever win the award. And while it might not be my absolute favorite game of all time, it's a really heartwarming and wholesome game. You can just feel all the passion that the developers put into this game, from the fantastic story to the fun co-op gameplay, with the gameplay and story of this game going hand in hand, as you need to work together with your other teammate to achieve success. It Takes Two fits so many different types of levels and even entire gameplay genres into it, and that's what makes this game one of the most unique platformers ever released. Everything is so refined down to the smallest details, and you can really just feel the love the developers put into this project. It Takes Two truly nails it all and brings everything together perfectly. Coming off the absolute banger of a year that was 2020, 2021 was not as stacked with other games. But the games that did come out in 2021 were some bangers too, with the nominated games being Resident Evil Village, which took the world by storm for its personality. There was also Metroid Dread, which was great, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and the game that a lot of people probably expected to win, Deathloop, with just how much praise it got when it was released. But a little hot take of mine is that I don't think it's the masterpiece a lot of people made it out to be, with the concept of it being absolutely fantastic, but the execution being good but not great. So while It Takes Two surprised a lot of people for winning the award, I fully believe it was deserved. Which brings us back to 2009's winner, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, the second installment of the Uncharted series. And from here on out, every game is a contender for one of the best games of all time. And Uncharted 2 starts this category off. Comparing it to its predecessors, Uncharted 2 made some massive changes and improvement to the gameplay systems, graphics and overall storylines, making it one of the best sequels of all time and cemented Uncharted as a staple PlayStation franchise. Uncharted 2 brings some huge and unique gameplay sections that to this day are some of the most impressive in the action-adventure genre. If you love action games and haven't played Among Thieves, what are you doing? Uncharted 2 has some of the most iconic missions and overall scope in its action set pieces in the whole action genre. It's truly a complete action game. So let's take a look at all the other nominees to see if any game competes with Uncharted 2. We have Assassin's Creed 2, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Batman Arkham Asylum and Left 4 Dead 2. Left 4 Dead 2 is the definitive zombie survival game in my opinion, and even to this day there's not a zombie game I consider to be better than Left 4 Dead 2. So it's a very close competition, but I do think that Uncharted might just be a little bit better, but that's fully subjective. Next up in 15th is The Last of Us Part 2. This might be the most controversial and divisive placement on this list, and it's pretty fitting as it is a really divisive game itself, as you either love it or hate it. But I'm kind of conflicted about Part 2, as it follows up one of my favorite games of all time that had some of the best character writing, motivations and overall story, and slaps you in the face with a pretty predictable and drawn out story with a revenge plot that in my opinion doesn't land. The whole timeline and story progression is super convoluted and takes away from the emotional ending it tries to achieve, as you don't want to play it the way the game wants you to play, but it doesn't give you any other choice, which just left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. But this might have actually been intentional, as it does somehow fit with the vibe that Part 2 has. So I can't take away points for what I personally wanted but didn't get, as despite my initial resent for this game, it still has the same outstanding gameplay and combat encounters that Part 1 had, and Part 2 even expands upon it in a couple ways with the rope and prone position for example. But the most innovative change has to be the way the NPCs behave when you are in a combat encounter with human enemies. The way they communicate and work together, so far as to call each other out by name, is just really fantastic and makes you feel like you are not just shooting some mindless AI, and instead you are taking down real people that can actually think and have feelings, which is really disturbing but a unique approach. Overall, I think where Part 2 lacks in story, it really makes up in gameplay, but I don't think it should have won the award in 2020, as this year was popping for gaming with all the nominees being bangers, and you can make a case for all of them to win the award, with the nominated games being Animal Crossing New Horizons, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Ghost of Tsushima, Doom Eternal, and my favorite game of the year, Hades. Next up is the first of many Rockstar games that have won the Game of the Year, which we will get to in a little bit, with San Andreas being the first game in the franchise that received the award back in 2004. Even though it's the lowest rated GTA game on this list, it doesn't mean I don't like it, as I truly love San Andreas. Even if it's not perfect, San Andreas might be the most GTA feeling game in the franchise, with the story and missions being so chaotic and all over the place. But I love San Andreas for being the chaotic masterpiece that it is. And it truly fits the vibe that a GTA game should have. The city of San Andreas itself is outstanding and really well designed, with unique side missions and activities that you can do. And while the remaster of San Andreas, along with the remasters of GTA 3 and Vice City, were an absolute disgrace with all its broken features, glitches and graphics that were somehow worse than the original games, it left me very disappointed, as I would have loved an actual good remaster of this game, as San Andreas is coming up on its 20th anniversary. But that doesn't take away from the fact that San Andreas is one of the best games of all time. Even when you compare its competition for the award, there are only 2 games in 2004 that realistically come close to winning it over San Andreas, with Half-Life 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, as they are both beloved games that still have really big fan bases to this day, but I do think that San Andreas deserved to win the award. But this next game might have the biggest fan base of all time, and is also the most recent released GTA game, GTA 5, that won back in 2013. I absolutely adore GTA 5 for how detailed and well put together the entire game is, and even over 10 years later it's still one of the most talked about games that you can find, with GTA Online still being updated 10 years after the game released, and all the mods that people have made for the game. But let's talk a bit about the story mode first, as I do think it's the most significant aspect of any GTA game. The biggest change from all the previous games in the GTA franchise is that there isn't just one protagonist throughout the entire game, but instead you go through the story with 3 different characters: Michael, the rich guy in a midlife crisis; Trevor, the psychopath; and Franklin, just a normal guy trying to escape the gang life. While these 3 characters all have a substantial role to play in the story, Michael is the most fleshed out character with the most screen time and deepest storylines. Along with the new story changes, GTA has a massive open world that is filled to the brim with side quests and other activities that vary from some tow truck work to street races. There is even an in-game stock market that you can invest in, and a casino for all you degenerates. GTA 5 truly took the world by storm and brought the franchise up from being beloved to absolutely adored by almost everyone in the gaming community. 2013 was a pretty good year for gaming, but apart from The Last of Us, there really wasn't any big competition to win the award over GTA 5, with Super Mario 3D World, Tomb Raider and Bioshock Infinite being the other nominated games. So don't get me wrong, they were all great games, but in no way as good as GTA 5 or The Last of Us. And this leads us to the last GTA game on this list, but not the last time we'll see a Rockstar game. So you might be able to guess the next game, and that is GTA 4 that won back in 2008. And you might be like, hey, you put all the GTA games back to back to back. And yes, you would be right, as I do believe that these games are all outstanding in their own right, and I think that most GTA games all perfectly execute what they strive to achieve. But I do personally find it really hard to rank and distinguish them from each other. So that's why I put them all together. Even though you might think they should be at a different spot or think that one of these games is way better than another, I think they fit together perfectly. Anyways, GTA 4 is in my mind the most significant GTA game, as I do believe that this was the real next-gen GTA experience that people claim GTA 5 to be, as this game marks the beginning of the more mature and realistic approach to the franchise, with the story being a gritty take on the American dream story that we all have come to know by now. And so we follow the story through the eyes of Nico. Nico is the perfect protagonist for this story, as he has his struggles, and while they might be a little bit over-exaggerated, they might actually be a little bit more realistic to the things you might see in real life compared to the likes of San Andreas. And this was a pretty big risk to take, but it all worked out perfectly. And this shift in tone was a great decision for the GTA franchise. The vibe of Liberty City goes hand in hand with the story, as it nails the tone that the story conveys, as you really feel like you are in a city that is rotten to its core. And this brings the story to the next level. GTA 4 has all the things that you have come to expect from a GTA game, with the usual side quests and activities around the world. And I do think that GTA 4 does it the best out of any games in the franchise. 2008 was an absolutely fantastic year for gaming, with games like Left 4 Dead, Dead Space, Far Cry 2 and Devil May Cry 4 not even being nominated for the Game of the Year award, as it saw Gears of War 2, Little Big Planet, Metal Gear Solid 4 and Fallout 3 being nominated. And while these are fantastic games in their own right, it is really difficult to compete with Rockstar whenever they plan to release one of their games, as they always bring Game of the Year worthy games to the table. That brings us to Bioshock, the 2007 Game of the Year winner. Bioshock is one of the most immersive gaming experiences you can find, with its story being so deep and immersive, and it even shines through its absolutely fantastic visual storytelling. The City of Rapture is one of the most interesting settings you can find, and it has one of the greatest openings of all time that instantly hook you into the game. Bioshock questions your morality, and depending on the actions you take in the game, you even get alternative endings, which makes the game super replayable just to see how the story would have have played out if you made some different choices. BioShock's gameplay is another element that they perfectly nailed, with you being able to strategize and think outside the box to overcome encounters with the environment and abilities you can get, allowing you to take a different approach to what otherwise might be a standard combat encounter. 2007 was an absolute banger, with games like the Orange Box, Super Mario Galaxy, Halo 3 and Mass Effect all being nominated for Game of the Year. But even beyond those games, there were a lot of all-time classics being released this year, some of them being Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Uncharted and God of War 2. But BioShock is one of my favorite games of all time, and it being this low just shows how good every single game coming up is. Next up is God of War 2018. This game did something everyone thought was going to be impossible to achieve successfully, with God of War 2018 completely shifting away from the hack and slash gameplay from the previous God of War games and taking a third-person view with a more grounded combat system. This was controversial to some longtime fans when they saw the new gameplay, but now I think everyone can agree that this was one of the best decisions they could have made. The story also shifted from a revenge-driven Kratos that is trying to kill the gods to a story about closure and Kratos having to come to terms with his past self while also trying to be a father to his son. This tonal shift is really well executed and is one of my favorite narratives of all time. While I do have some personal gripes with the boss variety and replayability of this game, everything else about God of War 2018 is near perfect. There is, however, a giant elephant in the room that you have to address when you talk about the 2018 Game of the Year winner. And that is of course that Red Dead Redemption 2 didn't win the award, which I do believe it should have, as Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the best games of all time and might be the most detailed game ever made. It's kind of a shame that these two games were released in the same year, as they are both all-time greats. And when you take a look at the other nominees, you realize they never stood a chance against these two titans. Celeste is one of the best platformers ever made and finally got the recognition that it deserves when the Game Awards usually ignore indie games. Monster Hunter World, Assassin's Creed Odyssey and last but not least, Marvel's Spider-Man, which also had the chance to win it as it is one of the best superhero games of all time and has one of the most emotional endings I've ever experienced, while also having a great gameplay loop. Overall, 2018 was a fantastic year for gaming and especially for PlayStation. This brings us back to 2006 with Oblivion, the fourth game in the Elder Scrolls franchise that we all know and love, and is also the prequel to Skyrim, which we will talk about pretty soon. Oblivion is one of the best open world RPG games ever released, with the world of Tamriel being big but never empty, as it is filled to the brim with side quests and encounters with NPCs and other creatures that make the world feel super dense and alive. This means that you can truly live out your fantasy in Oblivion and you can play in exactly the way you want to. The different factions in the game do support this, as they give you different quests depending on the decisions you make throughout the game and really make you feel like your actions have meaning and weight to them. One unforgiving thing that Bethesda added that forever changed the landscape of gaming was the introduction of the horse armor that they sold as a DLC that irreversibly changed the gaming landscape for the worse. And I will never forgive them for this. But looking at all the other nominated games, Gears of War stands out the most, with the others being Guitar Hero, Okami and Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter. But Wii Sports, my favorite sports game of all time, sadly wasn't even nominated. Truly heartbreaking. This next game, just like Oblivion, is one of the greatest RPG games of all time, with Baldur's Gate 3, last year's winner of the Game of the Year award. Baldur's Gate 3 is such a special game, with it being praised for its in-depth gameplay loop, which to be fair, I'm not the biggest fan of the turn-based Dungeons and Dragons gameplay, but I got myself over it, and I have to be honest, this is one of the most refined gameplay experiences you will ever find. And along with it, the story is also really detailed and well written, so much so that you can almost exactly choose how it plays out. And this is also what makes this game super replayable. And it really benefits from having multiple playthroughs, as some different decisions you make can lead to a totally different story and even varying missions that you can encounter. Baldur's Gate is one of the most in-depth games that has come out in the recent years, and you can really tell that the people over at Larian Studios had a lot of passion and fun making the game. All the other nominees are nothing to scoff at either, as it had games like the Resident Evil 4 remake, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. But the main two competitors for last year's award were Alan Wake 2 and Tears of the Kingdom, which are both outstanding games. And I do think that Tears of the Kingdom came closest to winning the award over Baldur's Gate, as it takes a Breath of the Wild formula and expands upon it. But I also think that this is the exact reason why it didn't win, as it didn't overhaul or introduce the biggest changes coming from Breath of the Wild. So I do think that Baldur's Gate 3 is a well-deserved winner of the award and truly a masterpiece. masterpiece. And speaking of the Resident Evil 4 remake, next up is Resident Evil 4. And while the remake released last year, I'm only going to be talking about the original version that released and won the award back in 2005. So while the remake improves on some of the more outdated stuff and might be better for modern audiences, the original 2005 version is the definitive experience in my opinion, and also the version that did win the award, so it would be unfair to judge it on a more recent release. Resident Evil 4 was revolutionary in many ways, not only to the Resident Evil franchise, but the survival horror genre as a whole. And the biggest change to the RE formula was going from a fixed camera angles that all the previous games had to a third-person view, and it is the best change they could have made for the franchise. On top of that, the gun mechanics also saw a massive improvement, even if it does feel a little clunky now, and that's exactly where the remake does feel superior. Resident Evil 4 has the best story in any of the Resident Evil games, with the usual over-the-top and cheesy plot points, but that's what gives this game so much charm that other games in the survival horror genre might lack. At the time that RE4 was released, the graphics were actually quite impressive and good looking, so while they haven't aged perfectly, it's the visual design and atmosphere that are way more important and what gave this game the longevity to make it so special, as the story takes you to very unique locations and settings that all have a totally different atmosphere from each other, like going from the abandoned village into the monstrous castle. RE4 is the best Resident Evil game there is and is very deserving of the award. As for the other games released in 2005, while they're all great, they don't really come close to how good RE4 is. These were Call of Duty 2, Fear, World of Warcraft, and the original God of War. That brings us to the last Rockstar game on this list, with Red Dead Redemption, that won in 2010. The reason why it goes this much higher above the GTA games that I ranked previously is that it does bring a totally different vibe that is more gritty and less over the top compared to some GTA storylines. But don't get me wrong, all of the games that I ranked previously are still all-time greats. The difference between 13th and 6th place is almost minimal, so it just comes down to my personal preference, as there isn't a big difference in quality between these games. Red Dead Redemption itself takes place after Red Dead Redemption 2 and follows the story of John Marston in the aftermath of the events that happened after the gang fell out in the sequel. The plot is very strong and brings up the themes of redemption and John needing to adapt to a world that doesn't want outlaws like him in it anymore. This works really effectively and the way they go about these themes feels really natural. The open world itself is fantastic, as you have come to expect with any Rockstar game, and really makes you feel like you are playing as the gunsling outlaw that John is. There is also a new system introduced in Red Dead Redemption that hadn't been seen before in any other Rockstar game, with the honor system that changes depending on the decisions you make throughout the game, and the world adapts to your honor level, which leads to some interesting interactions but doesn't change the main story in any way. So it mainly impacts the things happening in the open world and the attitude that John has. Red Dead Redemption 2, however, does expand upon this concept quite a lot, but it's in this game that all the groundwork was laid down. Red Dead Redemption was a benchmark for many open world games in terms of storytelling, and you will still find a resemblance to it in many open world games that were released after it. 2010 was one of the best years of all time for gaming, as there were so many great games released. For example, Fallout New Vegas and Alan Wake weren't even nominated for Game of the Year, and the nominated games themselves all being classics, with Call of Duty Black Ops and Halo Reach being two of the best multiplayer games of all time, with some surprisingly impactful story modes as well. God of War 3 and Mass Effect 2 were the other two nominated games and are both arguably the best games in their respective franchises. If you made it this far, please drop a like and subscribe, as I'm so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers and over 99% of the people watching are not subscribed. Let's get to the top 5. Starting off with what was my favorite game of all time until recently. And that game is Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which won Game of the Year back in 2019. This game is technically a Souls game, but FromSoft changed up the format that they perfected in the Dark Souls franchise, Bloodborne and Demon Souls in a way that makes this game stand out from all of them. In Sekiro, the focus of the movement and combat moves away from the slower and thought out dodge and punish combat systems to a faster reaction-based parry dance. And while this does take some getting used to at the start, as it is a really difficult game, once you get into a rhythm and get the combat and parrying down, it becomes one of the most satisfying games ever. But the main reason why people tend to play these types of games are the bosses, of course. So how good are they? Well, they are some of the best bosses of all time, and they all perfectly fit the combat system. So fighting them is really fun, but also very challenging, like you would expect from any Souls game. game, with you having to learn when to parry and find openings where you can punish the boss and deal some damage. But the main way to beat the bosses isn't to get their HP down, but to build up their posture bar to take out one of their health bars. I'm not going to explain it all here, but just know that this does require you to perfect the boss's moveset to take them down, which is where Sekiro shines. The narrative is also more understandable, unlike what FromSoft is known for, but still has the item description based storytelling like usual. So Sekiro's story doesn't leave you in the dark as much and is actually pretty understandable when you pay some attention. Sekiro also has some of the most diverse locations and is stunning in its visuals, with locations like the Fountainhead Palace for example, which is truly a sight to behold. 2019 was one of my personal favorite years in gaming, with some of my favorite games of all time releasing, like Devil May Cry 5, The Outer Wilds, and the Resident Evil 2 remake, which was also nominated for the award alongside Control, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, The Outer Worlds, and Death Stranding. I do think that Sekiro was the best out of the selected games, but you could make a case for any of the nominations to win the award. And this won't be the last time we'll see a FromSoft game on this list. Fourth is the second Elder Scrolls game on this list, with Skyrim that won back in 2011, and it's considered one of, if not the best open world game of all time. Skyrim follows up on Oblivion and expands upon the formula even more, with a deeper and more in-depth skill progression system and the removal of the class system, which leads to more freedom for you to choose exactly how you want to play. So it's, in my opinion, based on these things, a better fantasy RPG than Oblivion. But it doesn't stop there though, as Skyrim has an engaging story with many different interesting characters and factions you can encounter throughout it. The charm that Oblivion had still remains here, as the game is full of glitches which can be funny but other times are really annoying and even game breaking, which is where the modding community can step in, as Skyrim does have a big modding community to basically add anything you can think of to the game. Skyrim is one of the best open world RPGs you can play and is one of my favorite games of all time, but it's not perfect though, with for example the level scaling throughout the game that doesn't really belong in a fantasy RPG game in my opinion, as you could go back to the starting areas 50 hours into your playthrough, be all geared and leveled up, and still struggle to beat the most basic enemies there are, which always breaks my immersion. This however is not just a thing in Skyrim, but also one of my only complaints with Oblivion. But all that aside, let's take a look at the competition in 2011, as this was again a really stacked year, with Uncharted 3, Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, Portal 2 and Batman Arkham City being the other nominees. And they are all fantastic games, and even beyond the nominees there were some really big games being released, like Dead Space 2, The Witcher 2, Terraria and Dark Souls. But Skyrim is by a pretty big margin the best game in my opinion. Now we enter the top 3 with, in my opinion, the 3 best games ever made. And to be honest, these are all so close in quality to each other that there really isn't any big reason why one is over the other, as it really just comes down to my personal preference with these games. But in third, I put The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, that won in 2017. This was the first time that a Zelda game was truly open world, and it was revolutionary in a lot of ways, not only to the Zelda franchise but to the open world genre as a whole, with Breath of the Wild having non-linear gameplay and story progression, making you able to go wherever, whenever you wanted, and complete quests in whatever order you wanted, so it leaves it all up to you and what you want to do, which is so refreshing to see from an open world game, as a lot of them have an open world but don't commit to it and keep handholding you through the entire game. But Breath of the Wild set a stop to this trend, and a lot of other open world games that came after it followed this format, and this is one of the best things that could have happened in my opinion. The story of Breath of the Wild itself is great and works really well with the way they go about progressing it. And while I really wasn't the biggest Zelda fan before this game came out, this game made me really excited and a big fan of the franchise, with Tears of the Kingdom being just as good, even if it wasn't as revolutionary. On top of that, 2017 was a really big year for Nintendo, with Super Mario Odyssey also being nominated for Game of the Year along with Persona 5, Horizon Zero Dawn and PUBG. That brings us to 2015, with The Witcher 3 in second place. This is my second favorite game of all time. Even when I put all my bias aside, it might be one of the greatest games ever made, with the game being so detailed and refined. The story is super deep, with many different branching storylines that can lead to entirely different endings and can also result in significantly different interactions with characters. The world of Witcher 3 is super dense and feels super alive, as it perfects the 40-second rule, which makes exploring super engaging and rewarding, as you will never get tired of exploring, as there is just so many things to stumble upon in the open world. I even got sidetracked so often that I forgot the main quest because I just kept exploring, because it was so much fun, and I would come across a quest, and when I went to do them I would come across a different quest that I wanted to do, and so on and so on. You can find this design in a lot of open world games that came out after it, because it was just so so engaging and one of the best design ideas out there. The combat of The Witcher 3 is also very fun and fluid, as it does require some planning when you are playing on the higher difficulties, which I do recommend, as you do have to research the monsters you fight to find their weaknesses and craft the required potions or use the right spells to take them down effectively. In the lower difficulties this doesn't really apply, but it's still really fun to just hack and slash away at all the different monsters. Overall, The Witcher 3 is one of the best games I've ever played, but before we get into the number 1 spot, let's take a look at all the other nominees. Super Mario Maker was nominated along with Metal Gear Solid 5, Fallout 4 and Bloodborne, which are all nothing to scoff at. With Bloodborne and Metal Gear Solid being two of my favorite games ever, and speaking of Bloodborne, the number 1 spot is another small game that FromSoft has made, aka Elden Ring. This game is so special to me and is my favorite game ever made. Elden Ring is such a unique case, as it's basically Dark Souls but open world. And while a lot of people had their doubts, it worked out perfectly and made the formula of the other Souls games that scared off a lot of people way more accessible and easier to get into if you are new to the genre. With the game encouraging you to explore the absolutely stunning and gigantic open world that they made with so much love and detail. I remember in my first playthrough I looked at the map of Limgrave and thought, wow, this map is pretty big, that's nice. And when I finished the game almost 80 hours later, I looked back at the map and Limgrave wasn't even 20% of the whole world. Which just makes you think, how did they fit all of this into a single game and make it all so perfectly? And to that, I don't have an answer. Exploring is made super easy with the addition of torrent and a jump. Yeah, I know, a jump doesn't sound that significant, but it really is. Everything in this game is just perfect to me. From the exploration to the combat, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but let's focus on the story a little bit first, shall we? FromSoft learned a lot from Sekiro and how much easier it was to understand the story and implement this philosophy into Elden Ring. And while the story is easier to understand, it still leaves you in the dark just enough to use your own imagination and create your own interpretation of the story, which is something I really enjoy. But let's talk about the combat and the bosses, as that's by far the most important thing when you are playing a Souls game. And well, the amount of them is absolutely insane, with the base game having over 150 bosses. And while they aren't all the best bosses you'll ever fight, the bosses for the main quest and the other Remembrance bosses are some of the best in any Souls game, with my favorites being Morgoth, Radahn and Melania, that all test your skill to the limit. And before I'll talk about my picks for this year's Game of the Year, let's take a look at all the nominated games in 2022. The 5 nominated games were Stray, A Plague Tale Requiem, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, Horizon Forbidden West, and the biggest competition to Elden Ring, God of War Ragnarok. It's actually really unfortunate that both Elden Ring and Ragnarok were released in the same year, as they do both deserve the award in their own way. And while Ragnarok brings a more streamlined story, I do think overall Elden Ring is more impactful and deserves the award just a little bit more than Ragnarok does. And that brings us to this year, 2024. Now that the year is coming closer to an end, we can start to have some discussions for this year's award. And while there have been a lot of really great games that have been released this year, it's not been my absolute favorite, and especially for the AAA companies, it's not been so great either, with a lot of massive flops like Concord and the mediocrity of Star Wars Outlaws. But on the other hand, for indie games, this year has been massive, with the likes of Animal Well, Balatro and Hades 2 releasing and possibly even being in contention of winning the award. But I think the real competition is going to be between Space Marine 2, Black Myth Wukong and Astro Bot, which are all fantastic experiences, and I do think that Black Myth Wukong has the best chance of winning, but I do have a wild card for this year, and that is the Elden Ring expansion Shadow of the Erdtree, as I do believe that this is the best gaming experience this year, but the DLC has never been nominated for the award, so I think this will be unlikely, but DLCs are eligible to receive the award, and if any DLC should ever win the award, I do believe that the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC deserves it, as it is the best expansion out there and it's almost an entire new game. But do let me know down in the comments what you think.